Since the narrator of my dragon episodes, Tayron Janivar, first became an overseer charged with watching over his whole world, he's learned a lot of strange things. He's found floating islands full of bizarre creatures, found out that horrifying legends he's known about since he was a kid were actually true all along, and most recently found out that there's a whole organization of knights that have existed for hundreds of years who hunt down and trap and kill dragons well beyond anything he would have accepted could exist in his world just a few years ago. And as he's learned about more of these bizarre creatures and beings and kingdoms, I knew eventually that all would lead him to making a decision that is the plot point that kicks off today's episode. So I've been excited to write this story for a while. And on the community redraw side of things for this episode, I'm taking some of my subscribers' original non-aquatic creatures and I'm redesigning them into sea monsters that fit into this story. So I hope you all enjoy the Beast Chroniclers and the Blade of the Northern Tide. Let's go! Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. Kayla walked alongside Tayron in total peace and serenity. They were in a forest of his world and all around were gently chirping birds. A light breeze brushed her skin, painting her the ideal temperature. Tayron's world still fascinated her, seeming like something pulled from the pages of a fantasy novel compared to the modern dimension Kayla was from, though he found her world as fascinating as she did his. The last few months she and Tayron had been a couple had been some of the best of her life. They were both adventurous and curious, and could talk for hours or remain in total silence and just enjoy each other's presence. Tayron had even come to her dimension to meet Kayla's parents and grandparents, though they hadn't tried to explain to her Vavo and Vavu that Tayron was from another dimension. Charlie, of course, was with them as well, Kayla's sentient biomechanical enhancement, ever attached to her arm or body, who was, in a roundabout way, the very reason Kayla and Tayron had even met. Charlie, too, was enjoying the quiet walk, despite normally unable to go a few minutes without chattering a mile a minute about something. Everything was truly wonderful. But mid-walk, Kayla noticed Tayron's eyes darting across the ground with a somewhat concerned gaze. She gave a slight smirk and tapped a finger on his head. "What do you got running around up there?" He looked at her and gave a tentative smile, took another moment's pause, then said, "I think I need to go visit Eulers." He may as well have shoved a taser into her stomach. Her whole body got hot, her teeth clenched, and her eyes opened wide. Before she could give any verbal response, Charlie burst into word vomit. "Why would you ever want to visit the man who killed your mother and your sister and tried to ruin your life for years and has certainly caused the deaths of thousands, if not tens of thousands of people with all the human-hunting monsters he's made, not to mention his foiled plan to use you to wipe out all human life in your world?" Before answering, Tayron looked from Charlie to Kayla, clearly wanting to hear her response. Kayla just nodded at her motor-mouth ally and replied, "What Charlie said. I've actually wanted to for some time now. I've been the overseer of this world for over a year, and at every turn I find I'm discovering new bizarre lands and people and creatures that completely shake my view of what could exist in this world. There's no doubt Eulers was, and likely still is, a cruel and apathetic man, but there's also no doubt that having been the overseer of this world for a century, he's a fountain of knowledge in regards to what I should know that can help me better protect this world." Kayla nodded quite unenthusiastically. Every time she thought about Eulers, she got angry and had occasionally imagined herself going back to the island they'd marooned him on to smack him around a bit, but she never actually thought she'd have to see him again. She was still short of words, but asked, "How do you know he'll tell us anything? Odds are, he'll just try and kill us." "I know, you're right. But I still need to try." Tayron could easily tell that the thought made Kayla uncomfortable. "You don't have to come with me, and if you really want to make sure I'm safe, I could bring Heath or Mara or—" "No," she said bluntly. I mean, I'll come." She tried to shake off the anger churning in her stomach. It could be fun to see what a year of solitude has done to that monster. The next thing Kayla knew, through her haze of furious thoughts at Eulers' expense, she was astride Tayron's dragon ally Violet with him and Charlie, off to see the man who'd once tried to kill near every one of her closest friends. It was a few hours flight off the coast, and the whole time Kayla's head was spinning. She found herself fantasizing about Eulers attacking them so she could justify hammering a metal bio-mech enhanced fist into his nose. It was a thought her mind was all too well versed in. Tayrin asked a few times if she was sure she was okay with this. She kept doing something she'd always sworn she would never do in a good, serious relationship. Say she was fine when, really, she wasn't. But she convinced herself this was different because she wasn't actually mad at Tayrin, not in the slightest. She just really, really hated the thought of either of them having to see Eulers again. After a few hours' flight over the salt-spraying seas, they could see the island coming up. They all knew it was entirely possible Eulers had found a way to escape. Kayla daydreamed about him building a raft for himself, getting caught in a storm, and being lost at sea. But when they got closer, some new possibilities for his fate danced through her head. Just offshore from the island was a broad, somewhat battered ship. As they got closer, on the farthest beach, they could make out a group of people, all with weapons, surrounding what looked like a vicious, 7-foot-tall crocodilian scorpion beast. Eulers' red hair acted like a beacon to his location, as he stood closest to the creature, with all the people essentially surrounding him as well. Kayla got too much joy out of the idea that these pirates were feeding him to this creature, but as they flew in closer and heard his voice, it was quickly clear this wasn't the case. "Stand your ground and show no fear. The Dark Necrogator is one of the most vicious hunters alive for its size. It could kill you in a dozen ways, but it will likely go for your head with its tail. If it tries to run or swim off, we will go after it. Now that it has our scent, it will come back for us, likely at night when we're all less prepared." His eyes, and those of a few of the pirates, glanced up as Violet swooped down towards the beach nearby. Eulers' eyes locked on Tayrin, but his expression didn't change. "Ogwaho, take charge. I need a minute." Eulers marched towards them as Kayla and Tayrin dismounted from Violet. Kayla's eyes darted around Eulers' attire. He no longer wore armor as she'd last seen him, but was instead clad in a tight cloth shirt and a red vest. His scimitar was replaced with a polished saber. He sneered at Kayla as he approached, but noticed her gaze at his blade, then looked at Tayrin and saw his eyes were on it as well. He raised it and twirled it. Charlie shifted Kayla's arm into a laser cannon without her even having to ask, and she aimed right at Eulers' head. But his motion continued, and he tossed the blade into the sand, continuing his approach. He reached them, but walked right past. "Tayrin? You?" he said snidely as he barely glanced at Kayla. She was still debating shooting him as he kept walking on by down the beach. Tayrin jogged on beside him and Kayla followed, temporarily lowering her weapon. "I thought you'd have come sooner, though I suppose you may have while we were gone." No, this is the first time I've come back, but who are those people?" "They're the crew of Captain Darable, as am I. They picked me up 3 weeks after you left me here. Now, I'm their Beast Chronicler." They continued marching down the beach. "Pirate vessels attract massive quantities of sea beasts, partially because I made many of the monsters out there in the ocean specifically to hunt down ships that may have found and looted islands with magic-imbued treasures. Since I know the creatures of the sea better than anyone, whenever one arises, I instruct the crew on how to kill or avoid it." Through her fuming at the thought that Eulers had only taken 3 weeks of punishment on this island, Kayla noticed that they were actually approaching a distant tent, perched where the forest and the beach met. "We've continued to use this island as a resting point, though that won't be necessary anymore, with your help." "Help?" Kayla stomped in front of him and held her ground meters from the tent. "If you think we'd ever help you with anything, you're even more thick-headed than I thought." "I couldn't care less for your aid, but Tayrin will help. I know his demeanor and the circumstances well enough to know that as a certainty." "Tayrin has no interest in helping you either, murderer. Don't pretend you know him." "Pretend?" Eulers rolled his eyes and turned to Tayrin. "You're here for information about this world that you're well aware only I can provide. You also don't have a vengeful bone in your body and are infinitely more curious than vindictive. despite my best efforts to make you otherwise when I was overseer. After a few days traveling with this crew, you'll see they're good people. The item I seek, that only you can help me acquire, will greatly assist me in protecting them, which is my only current goal. So despite the fact that you do have every reason to desire to kill me where I stand, you're regardless going to be fully willing to help me in exchange for this. He reached 2 hands into a small pouch on his belt. Despite its minute size, from within it he pulled out a colossal bound book that strained his arms to hold. Tayron's eyes gleamed as though he were looking at a diamond. You have your own bestiary, but it's nothing compared to mine. Any questions you've ever had about this world can almost certainly be answered by looking in this book. It is yours after you help me, which is why I know you're going to help me. Correct me if I'm wrong, Janivar. As angry as it made her, Kayla didn't need to hear Tayron's response. She normally loved that Tayron was never one to crave revenge, but in that moment she deeply wished he was. Tayron's eyes finally pulled away from the book. I'll, of course, need proof that this crew is an asset to this world, not a blight on it. Eulers shoved the massive book back in the tiny pouch. Why do you think I've brought you to meet the captain? He marched around Kayla and stepped before the tent. Captain Darrable, I request an audience. Instantly, the flap of the tent was thrown aside and out stepped a man that looked right out of a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. He had a wide, black hat, a peg leg, and an eye patch that barely covered part of a scar running down the left side of his face. In place of a pirate sword, he held an axe. He was clad in mostly red, was broad-shouldered, and must have been shorter than Kayla, but his presence was so bold he may as well have been 10 feet tall. Captain, as I claimed, the man who can help us acquire the Blade of the Northern Tide has finally come. I'd recommend we set off for it at once. He and his friend have agreed to my terms. Kayla desperately wanted to interject, but was suddenly too anxious to speak up before the pirate captain. He loomed forward, and Kayla feared for a moment that if he deemed them unworthy allies, he may just slice through them with his axe. He looked intently at both Kayla and Tayron, then grinned widely through his thick beard. Well, how about that, eh? You weren't yanking my chain after all, old salty boots. He slapped one hand into Tayron's and the other into Kayla's and shook both vigorously. Captain Trenton A. Darrable at your service. Or should I say, you're at our service, I suppose. And we're glad to have ye, eh? If what Salty here says is true about that sword, once we've got it, we'll be right out for a rip, without none of those pesky fishy chucks giving her to our ship every half sec, eh? Eulers remained standing at attention as he said, Captain, I once more request that you stop referring to me as Salty Boots. And I once more request that you pull that lacrosse stick out of your bum and have a good time for once, bud. Darrable said, stepping back, slapping Eulers on the shoulder. Tayron spoke before Kayla even had time to finish processing what this strange captain had said. It's a pleasure to meet you, Captain, but I still don't know what this weapon is you seek, or why you require my aid to retrieve it. Well, the last time we tried to go get her was a real kerfuffle. The storm surrounding the Blade's temple near sunk us, and these sharky dragon things gave us a right hard wallop. Salty here says you can help us with both those troubles, eh? Eulers spoke up. The Blade of the Northern Tide is a weapon made by an overseer that preceded myself. It can control the weather and waters around any ship. It can also repel or attract sea creatures. Currently, it rests at the top of an island temple in the northern seas, and was left activated so it perpetually is creating a colossal storm around itself, and is simultaneously attracting dozens, if not hundreds, of sea beasts. A pod of sea threers, shark-like sea dragons with red and green crests, were a pest for us on our last attempt to acquire it, but that was only a glimpse at the creatures we may face. Presumably, Tayron, you're not particularly good yet at influencing the minds of creatures to leave us alone on this venture, as that takes many years for an overseer to master. But you can at least use your abilities to halt the storm around the temple long enough for us to once more make a proper attempt at retrieval. Once we have that blade, sea beast attacks and unexpected storms will stop being an ever-present risk to our crew. Interrupting the conversation, there was a loud cheer from the end of the beach. A spear-wielding crew member was on the Necrocroc's back, and its sliced-off tail was flopping on the ground as the creature thrashed viciously to get her off. It rolled right over on the sand, but still, she held on. Eulers marched back towards the crew. "Ogwaho, if you kill every creature yourself, the rest of the crew will never learn." The captain followed on after, joining in the cheering, but Tayren held back a moment, as Kayla hoped. She stepped close to him. "Tell me you're not actually gonna help that monster get a weather-controlling weapon for his pirate buddies." "Look, I know Eulers doesn't deserve our help with anything, but I have had such a hard time getting a grip on the dangers of this world, and that bestiary would be a huge asset to me." He gently put a hand on her shoulder. "I promise, if we get any sense that giving them this Blade of the Northern Tide is a bad idea, or that he's going to cross us, I'll step back, you can lay into him, and we can go. But I really want to give this a shot." Kayla hated the whole situation. She hated Eulers and wished Tayren hated him more too. But her love and trust of Tayren slightly outweighed that hate. Within the hour, they were all off to the Northern Tides. The waters were calm for the first leg of the journey, and Kayla spent those few days trying to get as much information out of the crew as possible about Eulers. She hoped they'd tell her that he was suspicious and cruel, but nobody had a bad word for him. Many said that he was stern and blunt, but an invaluable asset to the ship, that they regularly lost crew members to sea creatures before his joining their ranks. While she mainly sought information on Eulers, Kayla was also intrigued by the crew. They were a fairly ragtag group of people, but many had accents similar to Darable's strong Canadian twang, and around a third of them looked to be North American Aboriginals. Charlie spoke quietly to Kayla, still unsure of how the crew may react to what would look to them to be talking armor. "Why do you think Tayren is so forgiving of Eulers? I mean, I'm not one to hold a grudge, but if he killed you like he did Tayren's family, I'd attach myself to a dragon and hunt him down and tear him into 37 different pieces." Kayla was too distracted to answer, as at that moment Tayren was mid-conversation with Eulers about a group of knights Tayren had just encountered a week prior. Kayla hated that Eulers seemed to have answers to all Tayren's questions, and that he was devouring every morsel of information Eulers had. Her blood was practically boiling when an outlet for her anger arrived. The ship jolted, and near all crew members standing fell over. Kayla bolted to the side of the ship just as an orange beak shot forth from the depths. A purple-skinned sea serpent with no eyes burst from the water and aimed its maw towards the deck. "Oh good, I really needed this right now. Charlie, plasma cannon please." Charlie converted her arm and aimed at the creature's neck. Eulers sprinted across the deck. "Don't shoot it, you half-wit!" But Eulers' protest just made her that much more eager. She fired 4 shots before being tackled to the deck by the woman who'd slain the creature on the beach, Ogwaho. The plasma bolts erupted against the hide of the creature, and it reeled back. A trail of bioluminescence lit up along its side, and it let out a furious shriek. The cry sent a shockwave crashing into the ship. The whole crew was thrust back, as if they'd all been punched by a giant. "Great. Avitation sea beaks are peaceful unless provoked. Now we have to kill it. Ogwaho, stand down and hold defense. Let the rest of the crew take this one and get some practice for once." Ogwaho sneered, leapt off Kayla, and held her spear at the ready. Tayren ran to go below deck where his dragon mount was resting. "I can chase it off with Violet if—" "No! Its sound attacks can disorient a creature like yours far too easily. You'd end up in the water in seconds. Stand down. Of all the people on this ship, we need you protected the most." The creature's head suddenly smashed down into the deck, and 2 crew members barely dove out of the way. The head then raised just above the deck and let out a light hum. "Strike now! It's blind, but it can use echolocation. Anytime it makes that noise, it's getting its bearings." One crew member ran along the side of the ship and leapt, tackling a sword into the glowing blue of the creature's cheek. It thrashed its head up and shrieked into the air. "Good assumption, Douglas. The blue lights along its side are its weakest point." Eulers grabbed a small axe off the deck and hurled it. It sliced right into the blue of the creature, and it shrieked again, this time aimed at where the axe had come from. The targeted shockwave slammed against Eulers and sent him rolling backwards. Captain Darable drew his axe. That looked like it hurt there, bud. Perhaps we should wake up Gretzky for this? Eulers shook off the blow and leapt up. No, we'll need him at full strength for the temple. There's no telling what we might face there. The beast's head once more slammed into the ship, this time blasting a chunk of the guardrail off and into the water. Charlie? Kayla said, full of anger at both Eulers and now somewhat herself for having caused this attack. Let's try the hook and slice. Sure, I mean, that's a move that's only worked 3 times out of the 7 times you've tried it, but if you really want to do it, I guess we can. He shifted back into a large hand, then fired from her with a long cable attached. The hand latched onto the horn of the creature, and Kayla was yanked off the deck and shot up towards it. The hand then released and reeled back to her just as she was getting close. Her momentum carried her through the air as Charlie shifted into a long blade. Right on target, she soared past the creature's neck and crammed the blade into the blue glow. She sliced right through, tearing a massive gash, then kicked off the creature and slammed back to the deck of the ship, rolling into a barrel and banging her head against it. Dizzied by the blow, she pulled herself up just in time to see the creature writhing and sinking back away into the depths. She looked around at the crew. Some were still at the ready, some were recovering, and others were leering at her angrily. Eulers stomped across the deck towards her. I don't care what you think of me, you meddling imbecile, but if you endanger my crew again, I'll throw you overboard. She wanted to rage back at him, but knew she had just seriously misstepped. Before she could think of how to respond, Tayrin suddenly stepped between her and Eulers, and to her surprise, he shoved Eulers back. Back off, Eulers. It was a mistake, and you know Kayla thought she was protecting us. You threaten her again, and not only is the deal off, but I'll get the Blade of the Northern Tide myself just to drive it through your chest. Kayla was normally one to defend herself, but did quite enjoy seeing Tayrin shut down Eulers like that. But the whole crew suddenly raised their weapons on Tayrin. He held his ground. Charlie was still formed into a blade, and Kayla was ready to fight. Eulers was still, but his hand gripped his blade so tightly, it may have snapped. Well, now we're all a little testy here at the moment, eh? But how about we calm down? Remember that we're all working together here and nobody got hurt too badly, eh? Fishy chucks like that are an occupational hazard, and it won't be the last time we face one on this journey. Slowly, some of the crew lowered their weapons. How about I take our new friend here and have a little chat about the ship's chain of command and proper crew etiquette, eh? We'll get this all sorted. Back to your tasks, everyone. Captain Darable put a heavy but gentle hand on Kayla's back and led her across the ship, as others cautiously got back to their tasks. Captain Darable moved around a desk in the room's center and sat down in a small wooden chair. He gestured for Kayla to sit in what may as well have been a throne in comparison, across from him. This isn't your seat? Well, if I've got no company, then yes, but you're a guest on my ship, and you'll get proper respect a guest deserves. Even if you are causing a bit of trouble, eh? Kayla nodded and sat down. I'm sorry, Captain. I just really don't want to take orders from him, she said, nodding back towards the deck. The captain stroked his long beard. I take it you known him before this little quest run, eh? Seems like you're not a fan of old salty boots. No, he's an awful human being. I can get past the fact that he's tried to kill me before, which he absolutely has, but I can't get past that he killed Tayrin's mother and sister and basically tormented Tayrin his whole life, and I don't understand why Tayrin doesn't hate him as much as I do. Tayrin is the best person I know, and Eulers doesn't deserve anything from him, let alone his help getting this stupid sword, even if it will help you and your crew. No offense. Darable nodded and took in her words, then leaned back and tossed his peg leg up onto the table with a thud. You want to know how I got this here and also this here? He said, pointing from his leg up to the scar over his eye. Okay. See, back when I lived in the Great White North, believe it or not, I was second in line for the throne of the Kingdom of Trana. You're a Canadian prince turned pirate captain? How about that, eh? And see, I was actually older than my sis, so throne arguably should have been going to me. But she was the actual daughter of my folks, whereas I was the son of me mum and a Haudenosaunee man she'd gotten a little too friendly with, if you know what I mean. Well, she was on a peacekeeping venture out to the native communities. A Haudenosaunee? It means people of the Longhouse. Some folks from Toronto called them the Iroquois, but that ain't exactly right. See, my a whole bunch of times great-grandfolks stole the land from 'em where our kingdom was, and me mum always wanted to mend relations with 'em. But, of course, me being born half-native obviously wasn't a convincing argument for my old man to start liking 'em more. Anyway, skip ahead a few decades, and my folks both kick the barrel, so to speak, rest their souls, and my sis takes over, and, well, let's just say she inherited my dad's opinions of the Haudenosaunee. At her first High Court meeting, she proposed ending peacekeeping efforts with him, cause she'd gotten word some of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee were increasing their fighting capabilities. She thought they was gonna make a play for the land we was on, which rightfully was theirs in the first place, remember. I wasn't one to raise my voice out of turn, but I stood up and challenged her, saying she was out of line, and we needed to increase our efforts to make 'em feel respected by us. Maybe even give back some of the farmlands on the outskirts of the kingdom, as a show of good faith. Well, see, she didn't take too kindly to that, and saw an opportunity to show herself as a tough and take-no-guff kind of queen, don't you know. So right then and there in the throne room, she drew a blade and had at me. I had an axe on me, but dropped it right then and there to show I wasn't about to fight her. That was when she gave me this pretty little slice across the eye. What? Your own sister? Just for arguing with her? Well, she'd never been the biggest fan of me anywho. I spent more time in the native communities than I did with our own folks, and she'd a few times claimed I was a traitor. Anywho, after the first blow, she told me to retract my suggestion. I stood tall and said it wasn't gonna happen. Was being a little stubborn, I suppose, but that tends to happen when you just lost an eye. That's when she took my leg, and it's hard to stand tall after that. One long after that, I found out the Haudenosaunee nations was planning to play for the kingdom, and I was torn. Back then, I loved the thought of my sis being taken down a peg, on account of having just lost an eye and a leg to her, but I also knew a lot of good folks in Toronto. I also had even more friends in the native communities, so I didn't want to see none of the fighting to come. I gathered up a crew of peaceful folks, some from Toronto and some from Haudenosaunee, took us a ship and we set off down to St. Lawrence to the high seas. For the next couple months we sailed and took down other pirate crews we knew to be attacking innocent ships. We were on the adventure of a lifetime, more freedom than I'd never known on the outside. But in here, he said, tapping his head, I was still trapped in the hate I had for my sister, even when I was hundreds of kilometers away. I mean, that's fair though, right? She took your eye and your leg and just generally sounded pretty awful. I'd probably hate her too. But what good would it doing to me, eh? The time I spent hating her wasn't actually doing nothing to her. Eventually I realized I just had to let go. See, forgiving folks isn't something you do for them. It's something you do for yourself. You don't have to like folks that hurt you or your friends, but if you hold on to the hate you got for them, you're really just letting them hurt you even more without them even having to do anything to you. He stood up from his rickety chair and walked around to Kayla. I can't say I approve of nothing Salty Boots did to you or your friends, but I can tell you he's saved me and my crew a few dozen times, don't you know? I'm not gonna ask you to buddy up to him, but I do gotta make a personal request that, while you're on my ship, you listen to him. At least when it comes to the fishy chucks we're about to go bumping up against. Kayla gave a respectful nod, still taking in his tale and looking at the scar along his face. Charlie suddenly burst into verbality. Wow, sir, that was an inspiring story, and I can't wait to hear more about you and your life, and you seem like a fascinating man, and even though I don't like Eulers any more than Kayla does, I can say I'll surely respect your wishes while we're on your ship. Darrable just stared at Charlie for a moment, then looked back at Kayla. Miss, did you know your armor can talk there? Before she could answer, a colossal crash of thunder bellowed through the room. Darrable and Kayla ran outside to see a storm swirling above, and in the distance, barely visible through the haze of rain, was a pyramid emerging from the water.
Janivar!
Eulers yelled through the storm to Tayrin.
Now's the time! Calm these rains!
Tayrin nodded and tapped some of the glowing Overseer runes on his forearm. After a few minutes, he thrust his hand into the air, holding some of the runes with his other, and the clouds began to part. 5 minutes later, the sky was completely clear, but that just meant that an orange, monstrous sea beast was in full view, circling the pyramid ahead.
Great,
Eulers said.
The Smilaga's awake, and that's far from the only thing we'll have to contend with. Weapons ready, everyone. Let's get that blade. Maintain course. On guard, a pod of C3ers are approaching on our port side, but we're ready for them this time. Mirrors up.
Eulers barked orders as the ship pressed on towards the orange beast ahead. Tayrin still had his arm raised, holding the runes in place. Every time I start to lower my arm, I can feel the storm coming back. Eulers nodded as he raised a body-sized mirror above his head.
The sword is going to keep making a storm as soon as you let up. You'll have to hold it until we get the blade.
One of the C3ers, the dragon-like creatures approaching, caught a glimpse of its own reflection in Eulers' mirror and swam right up next to the ship, leaping consistently out of the water to stare at itself. Another crew member thrust out from behind Eulers and stabbed a spear into the creature's side. It shrieked like a furious dolphin and retreated. Then, they targeted another. Kayla ran up to Tayrin, ready to guard him. Charlie shifted into a blade as 3 of the C3ers in tandem tackled against the hull, cracking and jostling the ship. Tayrin was listening intently to the sounds the creatures made, then looked at Kayla. These C3ers sound like they're communicating, perhaps coordinating their attacks. Kayla listened and agreed. Right, I'm way ahead of you. Charlie, sound cannon. Imitate and scramble that sound, please. Charlie shifted into a loudspeaker fist. Kayla pointed into the ocean and echoed forth a garbled version of the creature's sounds. They all started swimming in circles and bumping into one another, leaping out of the water randomly. Soon, they all fled, but the trouble was far from over. They were now only a dozen meters from the pyramid, and Kayla could see that all over it were orange jellyfish-like beasts, not to mention the Smilaga still looming above them. 2 crew members had aimed back a cannon and fired it right at the monstrosity's head. 4 stone-like casings closed around it, creating what looked like a painted-on smiley face to cover its maw. The cannonball shattered against the guard and barely pushed the creature's head back. It then slammed its head into the first mast of the ship and instantly shattered it. Wood and rope and sails cracked and snapped and fell towards the waters. Tayrin ran back to avoid being crushed, still maintaining his hold on the sky. The Smilaga stomped a foot onto the ship and pushed it farther into the water. Eulers ran over to the paw and drove his blade into it. The creature thrashed back, then spun and hammered its head into the front of the ship, knocking it off course. A beam of orange light suddenly exploded into the ship's hull from one of the jellyfish creatures on the pyramid. More of them were charging up the same orange beams.
This is a disaster. The Jelly Drake Guardians are gonna blast us full of holes. Won't matter if we can control the tides if we're sunk. And with this many of them, they'd shoot your dragon out of the sky before it got 3 feet up.
More orange beams erupted into the ship. The crew fired back with their cannons, but the Smilaga's head swooped down again and smashed 3 of the cannons right off into the water. Eulers looked at the pyramid.
We need to get closer. Trying to swim the rest of the way is suicide, and
He looked around for a solution, but his eyes fell on Charlie. They then rose to meet Kayla's gaze, as she was trying not to snarl back at Eulers on the captain's orders. Eulers rolled his eyes.
Michaela, how far will that grapple arm thing of yours reach?
She looked over at the pyramid, gauging the distance. Far enough, but I'm not leaving Tayrin unguarded. He can't fight while he's holding the storm back.
He's not unguarded. Aguaho, take point next to me. Stand by Janivar.
Out of nowhere, Aguaho landed down next to Tayrin, spear in one hand and dagger in the other. Eulers planted his feet next to Tayrin as well. Looking at the chaos around them, Kayla said, "What if I don't trust you to protect him?"
We'll see if you trust this. Captain!
Darable just hacked a finger off the Smilaga, then turned back to Eulers.
I think it's time to wake Gretzky.
The captain smiled widely and just barely ducked under a swipe from the sea beast. Well, how about that? He stuck 2 fingers into his mouth and whistled as loudly as Kayla had ever heard. A roar suddenly burst from below the deck. 2 massive doors opened in the floor, and out from beneath leapt a 10-foot-tall dire beaver with buck teeth the size of Kayla's body. It shrieked and leapt from the ship and chomped right into the Smilaga's neck. Eulers turned to Kayla, who was baffled by what she was seeing.
Go now, get the sword and repel the beasts. You'll know how to as soon as you touch the blade.
She nodded. Kayla quickly grabbed Tayrin's head, turned it towards her, and kissed him. Stay safe, okay? He nodded. You too. Charlie shifted into a grapple again and fired up at the Smilaga. The creature was too distracted by the beaver to care, as she used it to catapult herself towards the pyramid. When they were close, Charlie shifted down her body and turned her legs into sets of jet boosters. They fired intermittently and slowed her descent enough to land gracefully and start running up the pyramid. 2 of the orange jelly drakes took notice. One ran towards her and the other fired a beam. Charlie converted into a shield and blocked the blast, but it was strong enough to knock her aside and she nearly fell off the side of the pyramid. The next ran at her and leapt while she was down. She rolled and flopped down onto a lower block, landing on her back and winding herself, but at least the creature soared on past her and fell into the waters below. She leapt up and ran faster and faster. The blade was in sight at the peak of the pyramid, and she was close. But then, 3 of the creatures fired, all in unison, dead on target. She raised Charlie's shield again, but the force was so strong it shot her right off her feet and she flew from the pyramid. Charlie quickly converted back into a grapple, and she fired her arm right for the blade as she fell towards the water. Just barely at the edge of the grapple's reach, Charlie snatched the blade and it yanked free from its perch. Kayla reeled it in as she fell, grabbed it with her other hand, and instantly a shockwave burst from her. It rippled the water below her just enough to ease impact, and she crashed into the ocean. Charlie shifted into a set of propeller feet and pushed her to the surface as she raised the blade above her head and looked around. The Smaulaga kicked Gretzky away and shrieked, glancing back at the blade briefly, then swimming off rapidly into the distant waters. The Jelly Drakes too all ceased fire and retreated. Sensing all the power from the blade in her hand, Kayla then pointed it towards the ship. Waves kicked up all around her and brought her straight towards the tattered vessel. The crew then spent the rest of that day celebrating on the pyramid. Their ship was in serious need of repairs, but with the blade in hand, they could now move just as well without their main sails. The members who'd been angry at Kayla for her earlier actions seemed to have quickly come around to her, and she even got to spend some time playing with Gretzky the Dire Beaver, who was surprisingly playful despite his initial monstrous appearance. Kayla had already handed the blade over to Captain Darable, and midway through the celebrations, Eulers approached her, with the same cold look he always bore. He sighed, grudgingly. "Thank you, Michaela, and... pet?" Kayla raised her bio-mech arm and said, "I think you mean Charlie." She expected him to roll his eyes, but he didn't. "Thank you as well, Charlie. This crew will forever be safer thanks to your efforts." Kayla stared at him for a moment. She still didn't like him, not in the slightest, and wasn't convinced he deserved the freedom he now had. But she also knew he didn't deserve the space in her brain he'd been taking up, and maybe he could do some good for this crew after all. She took a breath, smiled, slapped him on the arm and said, "You're welcome, Salty Boots." She then marched on by him to Tayrin, who was pouring through Eulers' bestiary, ravenous for all its knowledge. He ceased his reading as Kayla approached, leapt up, and hugged her tightly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all this with me, Kayla, and I swear I will do so much good for people with this information, and if you ever need me to..." Mid-sentence, she kissed him and cut off what surely would have been a lengthy apology. When she pulled back, she said, "You're worth it. I love you." She'd never actually said it out loud before, though she'd felt it for some time. Tayrin smiled widely back. "I love you too." Before I get into the actual ending spiel, I just want to say that the day after this video comes out, at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm going to be doing another live Discord exclusive Q&A. The PopCross community Discord is a super fun place. The mods do an awesome job running it. You can join with the little link in the description below. Come on to the Q&A, ask some questions, or just listen in. Should be a fun time. But now, of course, the actual ending, and here is our background for the next month, and I am super happy with it. I love how the art turned out and the story turned out. This might actually rival the original Beast Chronicler episode, which is still one of my favorite episodes on the channel. If you haven't seen it before, or if it's been a while, you might want to go back to that. But of course, thank you so much to everybody who submitted. It was really cool going through all your original creature designs, and converting them into sea monsters was a lot of fun. I might have to do some, actual full sea monster PopCross episodes, as I've been saying for a while, and we possibly have a narrator for them from this episode. Let me know what you thought of Captain Darable in the comments. And of course, specific thank you to the people who were chosen for this episode. Lord Tackshack, Omni Spider 85, Abby Boyce, ADM Namco, and Space Jumper. And let's keep on rolling right into the theme for the next month's community redraw, and I want everyone who's interested in submitting to send in their own original dinosaur design, or prehistoric creature. Could be like a woolly mammoth kind of thing, or just, anything in that kind of ballpark. I'll put a deadline and further instructions on screen, the usual spiel. You can submit to Discord or email, both linked below. Very excited to see what you all submit. I am going to be converting the dinosaurs into something, but if I
told you it would be a spoiler, and I don't want to go there yet. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and really the one I want to end with was better fleshed out in this actual story, which is that hating someone is absolutely a waste of your time. All it really does is distract you from the good things and the good people that are in your life. I hope that's helpful to someone out there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday, which is SCP Dragons Part 2. Goodbye.